Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and I really do hope you're doing remarkably well, and loads of love to each and every one of you. And why don't you go and get that lovely hot beverage, whether you drink cocoa, coffee or tea. I've got my lovely hot cup of tea here, so I'll be joining you. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Dahlia and I'm from Georgia, which is in the southeastern part of the United States, with exquisitely beautiful terrain that consists of pretty beaches, rolling verdant farmland and statuesque mountains. I live in the northern part of Georgia in an idyllic countrified Georgian-style home with a pretty pond, some undulating green lawns, a stables for our 3 horses, some grazing fields, a large apple orchard, and a magnificent resplendent wood green consisting of maples, pines, oaks and hickories. My incredulous Bigfoot story begins in the summer of 2006, when I was living in my wholesome family home with my devoted husband Bob and my mischievous, rambunctious son Alex, who was about 7 at the time. I'm afraid to have to admit that Alex was growing up to be a little scallywag and the biggest fibber of all time. As a mother, I had absolutely no comprehension of how elaborated, multifaceted and prodigious his lying had actually become. He was such an excellent liar that he could lie without batting an eyelid. Alex always wanted to be one better than anybody else in his entire class at school, and to convey much more dramatic, outlandish stories than anybody else that would invariably make him become the centre of attention. On one occasion at school, the kids had to talk about their mother in front of the class and describe what it was about their mothers that made them unusually special, as it was all in aid of Mother's Day. Poor one of the boys got up and told everyone in the class, "My mummy only has one breast, 'cause the other one got cut off because of cancer. Daddy says mummy's very, very brave." Everyone was exclaiming how sorry they were for his poor mother and how incredibly brave she was. "Miss Cooper? Miss Cooper?" "Yes, Alex, what is it?" "My mummy had both of her breasts cut off. She's also got a wooden leg as well. My mummy's braver than Paul's." "Well, your mother's very brave, but so is Paul's." Everybody was so shocked, and of course my son delighted in the attention he received. The teacher agreed heartily that I was very brave indeed. Then another boy called Derek got up and proceeded to tell everybody that he had 2 fathers because his mother recently got divorced, which meant he got twice as many Christmas gifts at Christmas every year. Once again, my assiduous little boy raised his hand and said, "Miss Cooper? Miss Cooper?" "Yes, Alex, what is it?" "My mummy has been married for 5 times, so I have 5 daddies and 5 times more Christmas presents." When Alex made up these melodramatic, magnified claims, he received so much attention from everyone. I was to learn that some of the children's parents would actually pack an extra cookie in their kids' lunchbox just for Alex. Give that to the poor boy, whose mother's got a wooden leg, they would say. Bless him. Mrs. Cooper, his teacher, also showed him special attention, which he lapped up like a dog that was given an extra helping of sausage. Imagine what everybody secretly thought about me. I was the poor kid's mother that was wobbling around precariously on one wooden leg with no breasts and had been through hundreds of failed marriages with 5 different fathers. I mean, it didn't get worse than that, did it? What kind of a bizarre picture was my son painting of me? But what gets me the most is everybody believed him. None of these stories were true, of course, but they circulated around the school like a rampant wildfire that was out of control. I would always notice the mothers at the school gate glancing surreptitiously at my legs and chest, and I began to feel quite self-conscious. One day it was the egg and spoon race at Alex's school, and Alex's teacher, Mrs. Cooper, went to the trouble of singling me out for special favour. She brought me a comfortable upholstered chair to sit on in order to watch the games, while everybody else was sitting on plastic, very uncomfortable chairs. It made me feel very awkward as everybody was staring at me, and I hated being the centre of attention. Mrs. Cooper nudged me and assured me that I didn't have to take part in the egg and spoon race under the delicate circumstances of my condition. I had no idea what she was talking about, but I was so embarrassed and humiliated that I never said a word and just sat there like a great big lump of cookie dough, looking like a complete and utter idiot and wishing with all my heart that the ground would swallow me whole. On one occasion when I was picking up Alex from school, a random woman came dashing up to me with a piteous, concerned look on her face, handing me a book with the title, How to Keep Your Husband Still Interested in You Years After Your Marriage. I think you will find it very useful, she said. There's some good pointers in there to keep the spark alive in your marriage. I remember thinking, what a hell of a cheek! Why would a strange woman I'd never seen a day in my life have the brass nerve, insolence and contempt to present me with such a peculiar book? Was she trying to suggest that my husband was losing interest in me? That was very hard to stomach. Then there was another time when one of the garrulous mothers at Alex's school invited me out for lunch to ask me for special advice as she was getting divorced, and proceeded to go into avid detail about the hopeless, dilapidated state of her broken marriage. It's so good to share all this with someone who really understands what I'm going through, she exclaimed. The excitable woman couldn't stop talking about herself. She barely stopped to draw breath. She then asked me if I could recommend a good divorce lawyer for her. I told her I didn't know any good divorce lawyers, and I was desperately sorry about that. I wished I could have been of better help. Oh, that's so terrible, she exclaimed. You must have had such rotten luck. You poor, poor thing, she said, taking my hand and squeezing it. I remember thinking how strange it was that someone should ask me for legal advice. I mean, what did I know about the law? My husband thought that the woman might believe I was in the legal profession, a lawyer or something. If that wasn't enough weirdness for you, I was asked by the school principal to represent a cancer charity at the school, which I did think was decidedly odd, given that I'd never had cancer myself. I'm sure everybody would love to hear your story, I was told. But I haven't got a story to tell, I assured her. Now, my dear, don't be so modest. I'm sure you have quite a story to tell. And in my book, it's women like you that are my heroes. I can only imagine the pretentious and theatrical stories my son continued to make up at school, but at home he lied non-stop about everything as well. He would tell me that his teddy bear could talk Hebrew. I would humour him and say, "Oh, that's nice, sweetheart. Maybe he can teach you how to speak it." "He doesn't want to teach me," he said. "Oh, that's a pity," I said. "He's not a very nice teddy bear then, is he?" One day when I scolded my son for spilling his drink all over the kitchen floor as an act of defiance because I told him he needed to bath, and he absolutely loathed bathing, he told me that he didn't like me, and neither did the horses in our stable, who had personally told him what a dreadful mother I was, and that they didn't like me at all. At this my husband laughed and asked him why the horses didn't like Mummy. You could see my son trying to think fast on his feet with what crazy fabricated story he could come up with next. "They don't like her, 'cause she's very, very smelly." "What does Mummy smell of, Alex?" my husband asked. "She smells like a pig," my son said. Lovely, I thought. My son is quite the charmer. One weekend when my elderly mother who was looking after Alex, while my husband and I went away for a romantic weekend break together, I returned home to see my mother looking at me with enraged, furious eyes. I'd never seen her this fired up before. She looked mad as hell. "How could you?" she said. "I didn't raise you to be like this." "What's wrong, Mum?" I asked. "I know what you did to my grandchild," she informed me. "Alex told me everything, and quite frankly, I'm utterly appalled and disgusted with you. I never thought a daughter of mine was capable of this abysmal treatment. He's only a child, for goodness sake. This is tantamount to abuse." "What did I do, Mum?" I groaned. "Out with it now." "Alex told me how you locked him up in his bedroom for an entire day and night, with no food, when he was very naughty. You can't do that to a growing little boy. He also told me that you confiscated all his toys for 2 whole weeks, so he had nothing to play with at all. How could you be so heartless and cruel?" "That's not true, Mum," I said. "I never locked him in his room. He's lying to you. And I've never confiscated his toys, ever." I was to discover that my little conniving, masterful little boy had successfully bamboozled his grandmother to buy him all the toys he'd been begging us to get him for ages. We had firmly both told him no, and it would seem that he had cunningly managed to manipulate his grandmother by pretending he'd been so hard done by both his parents. For in my mother's disgust at my appalling parenting techniques, my mother had brought Alex absolutely everything he wanted, with no expense spared, toy cars and the likes, and he looked like the cat that had got the cream. He was quick in learning that this guileful technique of his had huge fringe benefits and payoffs that were very rewarding. As you can imagine, I was growing increasingly concerned about my son's reckless, unbridled fibbing because it was getting seriously out of hand as far as I was concerned. I even sent him to a very well-known psychologist who assured me he'd grow out of the lying and he was possibly making these stories up to be the centre of attention, which was something I already knew. "Your son is as bright as a button," he told me. "Granted he's lying and makes up stories all the time, but he has a quick-witted, fertile imagination which should never be crushed or stifled. On the contrary, it should be encouraged. It's kids like him that end up becoming inspirational great novelists like the Stephen Kings of this world. You do not want to discourage his creative imagination. You need to humour him. Of course, as he gets older, you need to get a little tough on him if he's becoming rather headstrong, audacious and undisciplined, for he does need to know right from wrong." After meeting with the psychologist, I was feeling a lot better, but I was to learn from one of the mothers at school that after one of the kids at school announced that her parents ate snails and garlic along with frog legs in France, everyone upon listening to this proceeded to express their shock and distaste at such a thing. My little boy piped, "Well, Miss Cooper, my mum eats crawling snails and frogs from the garden like sweets." Everybody went, "Ugh, that is so disgusting." And of course Alex loved it. So now everybody believed that Alex had a one-legged mother with no breasts that got through as many husbands as people eat hot dinners and was feasting on garden snails and frogs like sweets. And let's not forget, I smelt atrocious like a pig, and my horses didn't like me either. There was one occasion when not trusting my son backfired on me, when Alex informed me in a nonchalant way that there was a fire ablaze in the kitchen, burning down the kitchen blinds, and of course I didn't believe him. Finally I got to smell the rancid smoke for myself and raced to the kitchen in a desperate panic. I had accidentally left a pan of oil on the gas hob to cook some sausages for Alex, and I had become distracted and forgotten all about it, and my kitchen nearly went down in flames, but I fought the flames with my fire extinguisher and thankfully won that battle. Like many parents, I did find putting Alex in front of the television did help to entertain him and keep him occupied, and he liked all kinds of programmes, including stories about Bigfoot. Indeed, he was so enamoured and fascinated by Bigfoot that he spoke of nothing else. One day he told me that Bigfoot was knocking on his window at night and beckoning to him to go and play with him outside. I remember saying, "That's nice, dear. Why don't you go and play with him?" I was getting increasingly tired of his incorrigible lies. Before long, Alex was telling me all kinds of tall stories about a little boy Bigfoot called Applejack that was playing ball with him with the plums in the orchard, and that his mother Sagebrush had a long jagged scar down her torso and big sad eyes. Alex told me that he'd given Applejack some of his toy cars because it made him so happy, and they loved playing together. I just said, "That's a very interesting story, dear," and that I was pleased that he was generous with his toys. Alex informed me that Applejack lived in the forest with Sagebrush and was very lonely and sad because his dad and brother were both dead, as they'd been killed by a couple of nasty hunters with guns. As you can imagine, I naturally assumed my son was up to his old tricks, making up all these incredulous stories, but I must admit I was impressed with what a proficient storyteller he was, and with what imaginative names he'd come up with, although it was such a pity it was all lies. After all, you can only cry wolf so many times. Every time I needed a babysitter, which was actually quite often, as my husband and I were quite social and went out regularly, I would hire our next-door neighbour's girl called Chantel, who was always eager to make some money. She was a pretty slender 17-year-old girl with long dark hair, blue eyes and fair skin. Chantel was permanently superglued to her cell phone all day and night, always tapping away at the keys of her cell non-stop, like a proficient secretary. I would sometimes hear the tail end of her conversation, and it was invariably always about boys. "Oh, he's so cute," she'd gush. "Or I went out with him once and he was real loser. Don't give him a second look." I knew then that even though her young head was permanently in the clouds and caught up in her girly telephone conversations, she was still reliable enough to take care of Alex, as long as she managed to multitask and look up from her cell phone from time to time, just to ensure Alex wasn't getting up to too much mischief. My son absolutely adored Chantel, and they would order pizza together, eat lots of ice cream and watch television. And he would chatter away, filling her head with all kinds of fictitious, marvellous stories. He even told her that my husband had a glass eye once, and Chantel actually believed him. I had warned Chantel of my son's overactive imagination and his ardent passion for telling fibs all the time, and she knew better than to rely on a single word he told her. But sometimes it was hard to doubt him because he was an artful liar at the very best of times. One day when I returned home, I discovered that Chantel looked panicked and dismayed because my son Alex was nowhere to be found. "He told me he was going to play with Bigfoot, and I just humoured him," she said. "But when I looked up from my cell phone, he'd just vanished." "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Madison," she cried. I really should have been more careful." "Calm down," I said. "Put down your cell for once in your life and let's find him together. He can't have gone that far." As any mother will tell you, losing a kid is a mother's worst, most terrifying nightmare, as all kinds of horrific scenarios go ripping and racing through your head at 1,000 miles an hour. And one of the most dreadful and ghastly of all is the prospect of drowning. The haunting thought that Alex, who couldn't swim, may have wandered off to the pond and accidentally fallen into the depths of the deep, cold, icy water sent waves of dread through my entire being. This kind of nightmare can all too easily happen to the best of us, as any parent will tell you. I had warned Alex not to go near that pond on countless occasions, but he was a disobedient rogue at the very best of times. I was in too much of a flurry to think clearly as terror literally shot through my body like a steam train on full throttle, and in my blind panic I began to function like a robot on autopilot. I literally dived into that pond in all my clothes, feeling around desperately for my son beneath the icy cold freezing water, but there was no sign of him, much to my relief. In my rampaging frenzy, I gallivanted around the whole house like a bull in a china shop, frantically dripping water everywhere from my soaking clothes that literally clung to my body like sopping rags. Then I darted aimlessly around to the apple orchards and stables with the alarmed Chantel running behind me. I kept shouting out his name in desperation. "Alex! Alex! Alex! Where are you, Alex?" Finally, there was one place I hadn't searched. It was the wood green, but Alex knew he wasn't allowed to go in there on his own. I told Chantel to take her car and drive around the neighbourhood looking for Alex while I searched the woods. As I ran into the wooded area, I could hear Alex's raised, animated voice, along with laughter and chuckles. The relief I felt was overwhelming. Without a second thought, I raced towards his voice, stopping dead in my tracks, because I could barely believe what I was discerning. My son was seated on the ground next to a little 3-foot Bigfoot that was possibly as young as he was, and they were playing with his selection of cars together. Both of them were making similar brimming sounds, brrr, brrr, and dragging their cars on the ground and occasionally colliding into each other and crashing. The little Bigfoot looked so human-like it was almost uncanny. Only he was covered in long golden brown hair and had exceedingly long arms and a pyramid-shaped head with very soulful animated golden eyes. Standing in watch over my son and the little Bigfoot was a guardian-like large female Bigfoot, and the sheer size of her was so intimidating that I was overwhelmed and seized with absolute, total and utter terror. In that moment I stood there on the spot, frozen like a block of ice, hardly daring to move. I would say she was about 8 foot tall, 600 pounds, and although she was slim, I could see that every single area of her body was covered in dense muscle. I noticed that the hair over her large breasts and her chest area was exceedingly scant, and I could see that there was a nasty-looking jagged scar running down her chest to above the top of her streamlined belly. I am almost certain that those were scars caused from gunshots, which made me feel very queasy and very ashamed of being human. I could tell someone had definitely tried to kill her. Suddenly sensing my presence, the female turned around, swiveling her head and shoulders together in my direction, and she looked up at me and our eyes met for a moment. I could feel the sadness and turmoil within the depths of her golden eyes, and I knew she was a creature that was grieving a dreadful, calamitous loss in her life. It would seem that she really was suffering emotionally. After looking directly at her eyes, my fears dissipated as fast as the steam from a kettle, for I perceived that she was very kind. I spoke gently to her and pointed to my son, saying, "I've come to get my boy." The female Bigfoot seemed to understand and called out to her own son in a chattering sound that sounded rather like she was calling his name, and he abandoned the toy cars he was playing with and ran obediently to her side, watching me ever so curiously. I walked over to Alex and hugged him, sobbing slightly as I cradled him in my arms. "Oh, Alex," I cried, "you gave me such a scare." I took him by his little hand and led him away, glancing directly at the female Bigfoot, and our eyes locked again in an understanding. She stood there not moving a muscle or flinching, as she watched me silently, walking away with Alex. "But, Mummy, I want to play with Applejack. I want to play with Applejack." During the weeks and days that followed, I never told my husband, nor anybody else that matter, about the Bigfoot that I'd encountered in the woods. It wasn't because I cared whether people believed me or not, but because I was trying to digest what I'd seen and come to terms with it myself. I knew at once that the benevolent, benign and congenial mother Bigfoot would never ever harm Alex. I found myself thinking about her all the time. My heart went out to her. I wondered all about her personal tragic story, and who had shot her, and whether my son's story about her family being taken out by hunters was in fact true. I began to suspect it was an accurate account, and a very likely scenario, and I felt strangely protective towards the poor female Bigfoot and her son, as life had been callously cruel for the both of them, and they certainly deserved better. I knew if they stayed on our land that they would be safe, although as incongruous as it sounds, I did hope that they would keep their distance from Alex. I didn't want to encourage my son's relationship with the little Bigfoot, because Bigfoots are so massive that if they play rough with you, they could ultimately harm you or even kill you based just on their huge size. I instructed my son that he wasn't to play with the little Bigfoot again, and he promised me he wouldn't, and I never actually saw the Bigfoots again, which was a mixed bag of blessings for me. This is my son's side of the story. Hi, I'm Alex, and I assure you that my mother is not exaggerating at all about my terrible lying when I was growing up. For some reason I loved making up all kinds of stories, as it made me become the centre of attention, and I loved that. I also enjoyed shocking people and telling them things that would really horrify them and make them gasp with astonishment, as their reactions were always fabulous. I've always enjoyed stirring the pot, and even as a teenager, I was the biggest prankster ever. When I was little, I found there were amazing perks to making up stories like treats and gifts that I would be given all the time. I made the most terrible, outrageous stories up about my mother, and everybody thought that she had a wooden leg and no breasts and feasted on our garden snails. I told everyone that my dad had a glass eye and was missing all the toes on his feet, and that shocked people as well. The funny part of it all was that people actually believed me, but it was like the high you get from drugs. The more sensational my lies became, the more shocked my audience, the greater the buzz. I think I was a fabulous manipulator, even if I say so myself. Of course, when I did encounter Applejack and told my mother about the experience, She never believed me, and frankly, who could blame her? After all, there are only so many times you can cry wolf. It was such a long time ago when I had that friendship with Applejack and his really sweet mother Sagebrush, but I do seem to remember knowing that his whole family had been killed by hunters and his mother Sagebrush had managed to escape with her life after receiving multiple gunshots to her chest area. I remember she had a jagged, ugly scar down her front where her hair could not grow back. I do not know how she survived, but she actually did, and thankfully was able to raise Applejack. I sensed that she was not bitter nor hateful towards human beings, but she was sad and lonely. I think she felt her kind are often misunderstood and harshly judged. I played with her little one all the time, but I knew it would be short-lived, because they told me that they never stayed in one place for very long, as they were nomads, wandering from one place to another. Also, Sagebrush wanted to find her sister Merrylegs, as she was so desperately lonely without any adult company of her own kind. It's weird. I do often wonder to myself how I knew all this information, but I truly think my mind was fed all this by the Bigfoots in some form of telepathic exchange, of which I cannot explain, because I would just know things about them in my mind, like what their names were, their plans for the future, the cave that they lived in the woods, and stuff like that. I must confess, even though my mother told me never to play with Applejack again, I firmly disobeyed her, and would surreptitiously sneak out at night to visit him in the woods, and we would play together in the large cave covered with deerskins. I really loved Applejack and Sagebrush, as they were so friendly and convivial towards me. I would often raid our fridge and bring them fruits and biscuits, which they loved to eat. I do not believe that Bigfoots would have ever hurt me, as they were more gentle than any humans I know. One day they told me they were going away, and I literally cried and cried for days. I do remember that. I never ever saw them again, and I do miss them. I am now 21 years old, and my focus is to become a fictional writer of horror, which may be why I've always loved to shock people in the past. Perhaps all the incessant lying as a kid helped my fertile imagination after all, and who knows, one day I might be the next Stephen King. So for all the non-believers out there, Bigfoot is real. So there you are. That's my story. What an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.